In the valley of Laconia, where mountains touch the sky and stone was more common than softness, a third son was born to the royal house of Sparta. The year was around 540 BCE, and the child's name was Leonidas, meaning lion-like, though at birth he was as fragile as any infant, held in his mother's arms beneath the watchful peaks of Mount Taygetus. Sparta was not like other Greek cities, where Athens built temples of gleaming marble and filled streets with philosophers. Sparta remained quiet, turned inward, shaped by discipline and the hard truths of survival. The Eurotas River wound through the valley, reflecting clouds and the slow turn of seasons, while the people who lived along its banks forged a way of life unlike any other in the ancient world. The house of the Agiads was one of two royal families that ruled this warrior state. Leonidas was born into privilege, but it was a Spartan privilege, which meant duty, not luxury. His eldest brother Cleomenes would inherit the throne. His second brother Dorius was stronger, more charismatic, destined for greatness. Leonidas, the third son, was simply expected to serve, to be another good Spartan among the citizen elite. The night of his birth was clear, they say, with stars scattered like silver across the darkness. In those first days, Spartan custom required examination by the elders. Any child found weak or deformed might be left on the mountain slopes, a harsh practice born of harsh necessity. Sparta could not afford weakness, not when they were outnumbered by the helots they ruled, not when survival itself demanded perfection. Leonidas passed this first test. He was strong, healthy, his cries lusty with life. He would be raised as a Spartiate, a full citizen, entitled to all the discipline and honor that entailed. His early years were spent in the royal household, but even princes lived simply in Sparta. The floors were stone, the walls bare, the furnishings functional. Beauty existed in craftsmanship, not decoration. His mother nursed him herself, as Spartan women did, creating the first bond of self-reliance. She sang him the old songs, lullabies about heroes and distant wars, about gods who walked among men. Outside their home, Sparta continued its ancient rhythms. Men trained in the fields, their movements precise as dance. Women managed households with a freedom unknown in other Greek cities, for Spartan women were expected to be strong, to raise strong sons, to embody the values of the state. The valley itself became young Leonidas's world. The mountains seemed like the edges of existence. Beyond them lay mysteries he could not yet comprehend. What was real was the earth beneath his feet, the river's eternal song, the faces of family, and the tight community of Spartiates who made up Sparta's warrior elite. As he grew from infant to boy, he learned the Spartan way of speaking, direct and economical. He played as children do, though even Spartan games taught lessons, races and wrestling, tests of balance and will. Toys were simple, carved from wood or shaped from clay. Everything prepared for what would come at age 7, the great transition that would define his life. His father spoke to him of duty, of the long line of kings who had ruled Sparta, of the covenant between the people and their leaders. His mother prepared him for separation, explaining that soon he would leave the household, that training would be hard, but that every Spartan boy walked this path. The land seemed to understand these rhythms. Olive trees that seemed dead in winter burst forth with spring leaves. The river that ran low in summer swelled with autumn rains. Nothing remained static, yet the essential nature of things persisted. And Sparta, in those days before the great wars, continued building the system that would make it legend. In the evenings, when the household gathered for the simple meal, there would be conversation about the farm, about the helots who worked the land, about news from the wider world. The helots were crucial to understanding Sparta. They were the conquered peoples, bound to the land, outnumbering their masters. This imbalance was both Sparta's strength and its deepest fear, the reason for constant vigilance, for the intensity of training that would soon claim young Leonidas. As his 7th year approached, the boy felt changes coming, like weather on the wind. His mother's touch lingered a moment longer. His father's gaze held extra weight. The world of childhood was ending, and the forge of Spartan manhood awaited. Soon he would enter the agoge, the brutal system that would transform him from a royal child into something harder, something purely Spartan. But for now, in these last gentle days, he was simply a boy in a valley of stone and silence, learning to walk in the shadow of mountains that had witnessed the rise of heroes, unaware that his own name would one day echo through the centuries, spoken with reverence wherever courage was honored. When Leonidas reached his 7th year, his childhood ended. On a cool morning, he walked with other boys his age toward the barracks that would become their new home. Spartan mothers didn't weep, or if they did, it was in private. They had learned to release their sons to the state, understanding that the child they had nurtured now belonged to something larger than family. The agoge was not merely a school, it was a complete system, a transformation lasting from age 7 to 20, designed with one purpose: to create warriors of perfect discipline, men who would put Sparta above self, who would endure any hardship and never know the meaning of retreat. The barracks were austere. Boys slept on beds they made themselves from reeds gathered from the Eurotas River, laid on wooden frames, no mattresses, no blankets, except what they could fashion. The rooms were cold in winter, stifling in summer, and always spare. This was intentional. Comfort made men soft, and Sparta needed hardness. From the first day, the rhythm was rigorous. They rose before dawn and ran through the hills surrounding Sparta, their young legs growing strong on slopes that would, in manhood, be their training ground and defense. The runs were lessons in endurance, in pushing past the moment when the body begged to stop. After morning runs came the first meal, deliberately meager: barley porridge, perhaps some cheese, water to drink. The Spartans believed hunger was a teacher, so the boys were encouraged to steal food, not openly, but with cleverness and stealth. If caught, they were punished not for theft, but for the lack of skill in stealing. It taught planning, observation, resourcefulness. Leonidas learned quickly. He watched kitchen patterns, noted when attention wandered, developed timing. He shared what he took with others, for another lesson was paramount. Survival was collective. The individual was nothing without his unit, and a man who thought only of himself was a liability. Days filled with training of every kind. Wrestling taught balance and leverage. They practiced with wooden weapons heavier than the real ones they would carry, building strength. Music was part of training, too, for the Spartans understood that rhythm and coordination were essential to warfare. Men who could march in step, maintain formation while advancing or retreating, had enormous advantage. They learned poetry, particularly the works of Tertius, whose verses celebrated martial valor. For it is a fair thing for a good man to fall and die fighting in the front rank for his fatherland. The words became part of them, a rhythm in the mind that would surface in moments of crisis. Discipline came through peer pressure more than punishment. Boys were organized into groups, each responsible for all members. If one failed, the group suffered. This created powerful incentive to excel, not for personal glory, but to avoid letting down companions. Leonidas found himself naturally suited to this life. He was not the strongest or fastest, but he possessed steadiness. He did not panic under pressure, did not let frustration cloud judgment. Where his brothers had perhaps overshadowed him at home, here his qualities could shine. Winters were hardest. The barracks were freezing, and boys were given minimal clothing. They learned to exercise to stay warm, to sleep close together for shared heat, to endure the chill as another form of training. Sometimes they were sent into winter storms to practice survival, learning to find shelter, build fires from damp wood, navigate when landmarks disappeared. As years passed, Leonidas grew. The softness of childhood burned away like morning mist. He learned Spartan speech, laconic and precise. When asked a question, he answered with economy. When given an order, he obeyed without hesitation. But this was not mindless obedience. The agoge taught thinking, the ability to assess and act appropriately. There was a famous ritual at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where boys were whipped to test their endurance. When Leonidas's turn came, he approached with characteristic calm. The first lash was fire across his back, pain so intense it seemed to white out thought. But he had learned to separate himself from sensation, to observe pain as if it happened to someone else. He set his jaw, fixed his eyes on a distant point, and endured without crying out. As he moved into his teenage years, training became more martial. They learned phalanx fighting, each man carrying a large round shield that protected not just himself, but the man to his left, creating an overlapping wall of bronze and wood. The phalanx required absolute discipline. If one man broke, the entire formation was compromised. Leonidas learned his place in the line. He was steady, reliable, and instructors noted this. A man who could be counted on was worth 10 who were merely brave. They learned the paean, the battle hymn Spartans sang as they advanced, a measured rhythmic chant that kept the phalanx moving at the right pace. The food remained simple, the comforts few. But Leonidas found satisfaction in small things, a well-executed drill, the respect of peers, the occasional word of approval from an instructor. As he approached manhood, the final phase tested everything. Boys were sent into the countryside with minimal supplies, told to survive, to avoid detection by patrols that searched for them. When the agoge was complete, when Leonidas had proven himself worthy, he was accepted as a full citizen at age 20. He stood with other graduates in the agora as the sun set, casting long shadows. The ephors gave a brief speech about duties and honor. Then, simply, it was done. They were Spartans, full members of the warrior elite. That night he dined in the Syssitia, the communal mess, for the first time as an equal. The food was the same as always, simple and nourishing, but the context was different. He ate now not as a student, but as a citizen, as a warrior, as a man who had earned his place. The years had shaped him in ways both visible and invisible. His body was lean and strong, capable of extraordinary endurance. His mind was disciplined, able to focus under pressure. But most importantly, he had internalized Sparta's values so completely that they were no longer rules imposed from outside, but simply the way he understood the world. He knew his life was not his own, that it belonged to Sparta, to be spent when and how the state required. He knew that honor was more important than survival, that reputation outlasted life, and that a man's worth was measured not in wealth or comfort, but in service and sacrifice. As evening wore on and he stepped outside, the air was cool and clean, stars emerging in the darkening sky. He looked over the valley, over the land he was sworn to protect, and felt deep connection. This was home, not just the house where he was born, but the entirety of Laconia, every stone and stream, every olive tree and mountain path. The Agorge was behind him. What lay ahead was the life of a citizen, a soldier, and eventually, though he could not know it yet, a king. But that is a story for the chapters to come. The household of the Agiad kings was a place where brotherhood and rivalry lived in close quarters, where the weight of lineage pressed upon each son differently. Leonidas, having completed the Agorge, now returned to the orbit of his family, though he was no longer the boy who had left years before. His eldest brother, Cleomenes, had ascended to the throne following their father's death. Cleomenes was a man of fierce intelligence and fiercer ambition, qualities that made him both effective and dangerous. He wielded power with cunning, reshaping Spartan foreign policy, intervening in other cities, asserting dominance. The second brother, Dorieus, had always been exceptional. Taller, stronger, more gifted in martial arts. Many believed he should have been king instead of Cleomenes. But Spartan law was clear. The eldest son inherited, regardless of merit. Dorieus could not reconcile himself to this accident of birth. Leonidas, the third son, occupied different space entirely. He had no claim to the throne, no expectation of power. This freedom allowed him to simply be a good Spartan, to serve in the army, to live the life the Agorge had prepared him for, without the complications of royal politics. In the years following the Agorge, Leonidas served in Sparta's constant conflicts, border disputes, interventions in allied cities, punitive expeditions against Helot unrest. He proved capable, following orders precisely, showing initiative when appropriate, never seeking glory at the expense of mission. He advanced through ranks, not rapidly but steadily, earning each promotion through demonstrated competence. Cleomenes was reshaping Sparta's role in Greece, aggressive in asserting interests, engaging in conflicts with Argos. Some ventures succeeded, others failed, but all demonstrated his determination to make Sparta dominant. Meanwhile, Dorieus chafed under his position. His pride, ambition, and sense of destiny became sources of frustration. Finally, Dorieus made a dramatic choice. He would leave Sparta and found a colony elsewhere, creating a kingdom of his own. It was bold and sad. Colonization was recognized Greek tradition, but for a prince to leave because he could not rule at home carried the taint of failure. Leonidas was present when Dorius announced his intention. Cleomenes sat in authority, face unreadable. Dorius stood defiant, explaining plans to establish a city in Libya where the Delphic oracle had promised fortune. When Dorius asked Leonidas to accompany him, to be part of this new venture, there was long silence. It was appealing, a chance to build something new, to be part of history rather than maintaining tradition. But Leonidas shook his head. His place was in Sparta. He had been shaped for this specific duty, to serve this specific state. To leave would be to abandon everything the agoge had instilled. With regret, but without hesitation, he declined. Dorius departed with his followers, and the household felt the absence. News came irregularly from the colony. At first, things seemed promising, but Libya proved inhospitable. After 3 years, Dorius abandoned the colony and attempted another in Sicily. For a time, it seemed he might succeed. But the Carthaginians and native Elymians united against him. In the battle that followed, Dorius fell, fighting with courage that had always defined him, dying far from home. When news reached Sparta, a messenger came travel-worn and somber. Dorius was dead, killed in Sicily. His dream of a kingdom ended in foreign dust. Leonidas felt the weight settle over him. Dorius had been difficult, proud, perhaps foolish in refusing to accept his place. But he had been brave, had been vital, had been his brother. The world seemed diminished. Cleomenes received the news with characteristic control, face revealing nothing. Whatever conflicts had existed, they had been brothers. Funeral rites were conducted with full honors, though there was no body. They performed ceremonies symbolically, offering sacrifices, singing laments that had been sung for Spartan warriors since time immemorial. As Leonidas participated, he reflected on the paths the 3 brothers had taken. Cleomenes sought power and achieved it, but at what cost? Dorius sought glory and found death, his ambitions leading ever further from home until he could not return. And Leonidas himself had chosen acceptance to be what Sparta needed rather than what his own desires suggested. With Dorius gone, the royal house dynamics shifted. Leonidas spent more time in Cleomenes' company, not as confidant, but as presence, reminder of family and continuity. Cleomenes, for all his brilliance, was increasingly erratic. Rumors of madness circulated, whispers that the king wasn't always in full possession of his faculties. Leonidas watched these changes with concern. He saw his brother become more suspicious, prone to sudden rages and equally sudden withdrawals. But there was little he could do. To question a king, even a brother who was king, was to step beyond propriety. During this period, Leonidas married Gorgo, daughter of Cleomenes, his own niece. Such marriages were common among Spartan royalty. But Gorgo was remarkable in her own right, intelligent, strong-willed, possessed of wisdom beyond her years. There was a famous story from her childhood when a foreign envoy tried to bribe Cleomenes. 8-year-old Gorgo had warned her father, "You had better go away, or the stranger will corrupt you." The marriage was one of mutual respect. In Sparta, where women had more freedom than in other Greek cities, a wife was expected to be partner, not subordinate. Gorgo managed the household with efficiency, engaged in social and political life with confidence. They had a daughter, and in Spartan fashion, she would be raised with emphasis on strength and virtue. Life settled into rhythm. Leonidas served in the army, participated in Syssitia, fulfilled duties of a Spartiate. He was not famous, not celebrated, but he was respected. His name carried weight not because of royal blood, but because of consistent excellence. Cleomenes launched a campaign against Argos, Sparta's ancient enemy. The battle at Sipea was a massacre. Cleomenes destroyed the Argive army, killing thousands. It was stunning victory, but Cleomenes did not march on Argos itself, did not complete the destruction. He claimed the gods had forbidden it. Some believed him, others whispered of bribery. Still others suggested his madness prevented clear seeing. Leonidas had fought in that battle, stood in the phalanx, felt the shock of impact. He watched Argives die in their thousands and wondered whether this was glory or slaughter, whether there was honor in such one-sided victory. But he kept these thoughts to himself. A Spartan did not question the necessity of war. Years passed, and Cleomenes' behavior became more erratic. Violence, paranoia, actions with no rational basis. Finally, the ephors and Gerousia determined he must be restrained. Cleomenes was confined, placed under guard. Then, in murky circumstances, he died. The official account was suicide in madness. But there were whispers of murder. Leonidas, hearing the news, felt complex emotions. Grief for his brother, certainly. Relief that a troubled situation had concluded. And beneath it all, growing awareness that his own life was about to change fundamentally. For with Cleomenes dead and Dorius long gone, succession fell to Leonidas, the third son, who had never expected to rule, who had shaped his life around service rather than command, was now king of Sparta. The announcement was made in the agora with Spartan formality. The ephors proclaimed him King Leonidas of the Agiad house. The citizens received the news with typical reserve. Leonidas stood before them. This man, now in his 40s, body still strong from training, face weathered by years of service. He looked at the assembled Spartiates, at the citizens now his responsibility, and felt the crown's weight settle upon him. He thought of his brothers, both destroyed in different ways by the very qualities that made them exceptional, and he made a silent vow. He would rule differently. He would not seek glory like Dorius, would not grasp for power like Cleomenes. He would simply try to be what Sparta needed: steady, reliable, worthy of trust. That night, in the royal house that was now his, he sat with Gorgo. "You will be a good king," she said simply. "I will try to be what they need," he replied. "That is all any of us can do," she said. "Be what we are needed to be." And so Leonidas, the third son, the one who had never sought the throne, became king. The fame that would make his name immortal still lay ahead, hidden like a river running underground, invisible but certain in its course. Beyond the eastern horizon, beyond the Aegean Sea and the coast of Asia Minor, a power was rising that would eventually draw all of Greece into its orbit. Persia, vast and ancient, was building an empire unlike anything the Greek world had known. It stretched from the Indus River to the Mediterranean shores, a dominion so large it seemed to encompass half the known world. Under Darius the Great, Persia had reached heights of power and organization that made it the dominant force of the age. To the Greeks, Persia was a land of contradictions. It was wealthy beyond imagination, its cities filled with gold, its kings living in unparalleled splendor. But it was also, to Greek eyes, a land of slavery, where all men bowed before the great king, where freedom as Greeks understood it did not exist. The first significant contact came when Darius extended his empire into Thrace and Macedonia, bringing the northern edges of the Greek world under Persian influence. Then came the Ionian Revolt, when Greek cities of Asia Minor rose in rebellion against Persian rule. Athens and Eretria sent aid to the Ionian rebels, a decision with profound consequences. The revolt was crushed, and Darius, angered by this interference, determined to punish the cities that had dared challenge his authority. Persia, which had seemed a distant problem, suddenly became an immediate threat. In Sparta, news arrived through various channels. Merchants brought stories, refugees carried experiences, envoys sought alliances. Slowly, the reality of the Persian threat came into focus. Leonidas, as king, listened to these reports with careful attention. He understood that Sparta, for all its military prowess, was a land power, ill-equipped for distant campaigns. But he also understood that if Persia subdued all Greece, even Sparta would not be safe. The geography was crucial. Persia could not easily bring full strength to bear on Greece. The Aegean Sea was a barrier, and mountain passes created natural choke points. If the Greeks could unite, if they could put aside endless rivalries and present a common front, they had a chance. But Greek unity was rare, more often hoped for than achieved. Then came news that crystallized the threat. Darius sent a great expedition across the Aegean, a fleet carrying thousands of soldiers, aimed at Athens and Eretria. The Persians landed first at Eretria, besieged the city, and when it fell through betrayal, they burned it and enslaved its population. Then they moved against Athens. The Athenians, facing existential threat, sent desperate calls for help throughout Greece. Most cities declined, fearful of Persian wrath. But Sparta agreed to send aid. However, a religious festival was underway, and Spartan law forbade military expeditions during this sacred time. The Athenians, unable to wait, marched to meet the Persians at Marathon. There, on the plain between mountains and sea, they won an astonishing victory. The Persian army, vastly superior in numbers, was routed. It was triumph that would echo through history, proof that Persians could be beaten. When the Spartans arrived, the battle was over. They had marched with all speed once the festival concluded, covering the distance in just 3 days. But they came too late to fight. They could only view the battlefield and congratulate the Athenians. Leonidas was not part of that expedition, but he understood the implications. Marathon had bought time, but it had not ended the threat. Darius would not accept such defeat lightly. Persia would return, and when it did, the force would be even greater. In the years that followed, Darius died, and his son Xerxes inherited the throne. For a time, there was uncertainty about whether the new king would continue his father's policy. But Xerxes, perhaps spurred by advisers, perhaps driven by desire to avenge his father, perhaps following the logic of imperial expansion, decided to complete what Darius had begun. This time, the scale would be different. Xerxes would bring the full weight of empire. He began preparations that staggered imagination, assembling armies from all corners of his realm, building bridges across the Hellespont to allow forces to cross from Asia to Europe, digging a canal through the Athos Peninsula. News of these preparations reached Greece in fragments, each report more alarming than the last. The numbers mentioned seemed impossible. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, perhaps even 1,000,000, with fleets numbering thousands of ships. Even allowing for exaggeration, it was clear that something unprecedented was coming. In Sparta, Leonidas received these reports with growing concern. This was not a punitive expedition like Marathon. This was an invasion, an attempt to conquer Greece entirely. The stakes could not be higher. Defeat meant slavery, the end of the Greek way of life, the extinction of everything Sparta represented. The question was what to do. Some argued for defense at the Isthmus of Corinth, the narrow neck connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. But Leonidas saw the flaw. Abandoning central Greece and Athens would alienate potential allies. Athens had a powerful navy, crucial for defense. And there was a moral dimension. Could Sparta, which prided itself on courage, simply hide behind walls and let others face the enemy alone? The oracle at Delphi was consulted. Her response, cryptic as always, suggested both doom and hope. The priestess spoke of a choice. Either Sparta would fall, or a king of Sparta would die. The exact words were analyzed and interpreted. Leonidas heard what he needed to hear. A call to duty, a clear statement of what might be required. Months passed, and Xerxes' preparations continued. Envoys traveled throughout Greece, demanding earth and water, symbols of submission. Some cities complied, others refused, choosing to face whatever came rather than surrender freedom. When Persian envoys came to Sparta, the response was characteristically blunt. The Spartans threw them into a pit, telling them to get their earth and water there. It was a violation of sacred envoy status, but also a clear statement. Sparta would not submit. Not now, not ever. Leonidas approved of this response. There could be no ambiguity, no room for Xerxes to believe that Sparta might be intimidated or bribed. The line was drawn, the commitment made. Now it was simply a matter of preparing for inevitable conflict. In councils where Greek city representatives met, strategies were debated. Themistocles of Athens argued that Greece's salvation lay in its navy, that the Persian fleet must be engaged and defeated. Leonidas recognized the wisdom, even though naval warfare was not Sparta's strength. He supported the strategy, understanding that different cities would contribute in different ways. But there was still the question of where to make the first stand against the Persian army. The answer came from studying geography, understanding routes any invading force would take. The pass at Thermopylae, the hot gates named for thermal springs in the area, was one such place. It was narrow between mountains and sea, a place where a small force could hold against a much larger one. If the Greeks could block this pass while the navy engaged the Persian fleet nearby, they might stop the invasion before it reached central Greece. The strategy began to take shape, a coordinated defense on land and sea, buying time, exploiting terrain, making the Persians pay dearly for every advance. Leonidas was chosen to command the force that would march to Thermopylae. It was logical. He was a Spartan king, universally respected, experienced, known for calm judgment. But it was also heavy responsibility, for the decision of where and how to fight might determine the fate of all Greece. The winds from the east carried a sense of destiny, the feeling that great events were in motion. In Sparta, people prepared with quiet efficiency. Leonidas spent time with Gorgo, knowing he would soon leave. They spoke of practical matters, but also of the life they had built together, of values they shared. "If I do not return," Leonidas said one evening, "remember that I did what was necessary." Gorgo looked at him with clear eyes. "I know you will do what is right. That is who you are." As the spring approached, the time for action drew near. Xerxes' army was on the move, crossing the Hellespont, marching through Thrace, an endless column coming westward like a tide. Scouts brought reports of this vast host, struggling to convey its size. It was like a migration, a movement of peoples, not just an army, but an entire world in motion. Leonidas knew the time had come. The narrow pass called Thermopylae waited, and with it, destiny itself. The column began its journey in the cool hours of early morning, when mist still clung to valleys and mountains were shadows against the lightening sky. 300 Spartans marched in perfect formation, their crimson cloaks marking them clearly. Around them came the allies, Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, and others, swelling the force to several thousand strong. These were not the full Spartan army. Religious festivals again intervened, and Spartan law required most forces remain until sacred rites were complete. But Leonidas would take 300 Spartans, all of them fathers with living sons, men whose lines would continue even if they themselves fell. This detail was deliberate. Sparta could not afford to lose entire family lines. The route north took them through familiar territory at first, the hills and valleys of Laconia that every Spartan knew from childhood. They moved at the steady pace of a trained infantry, covering ground efficiently without exhaustion. This was not a race, but a deployment. They would need their strength when they arrived. Leonidas marched with his men, not at the rear commanding, but at the front sharing every step. It was the Spartan way. Leaders did not ride while soldiers walked, did not enjoy comfort while others endured hardship. He wore the same armor, carried the same weapons, breathed the same dust raised by thousands of feet. The first day took them through foothills of Mount Taygetus, the great peak standing guardian over Sparta. Looking back at it, Leonidas felt the weight of all those who had walked this path before, generations of Spartans marching to war. They made camp that night in a valley where a stream provided fresh water, the organization precise, each unit knowing its position. As darkness fell, Leonidas walked among the men, stopping to speak with small groups, asking about their condition, listening to observations. These were not grand speeches or formal inspections, simply a commander staying connected to those he led. On the second day, they passed through Tegea and then Argos, cities with complex relationships with Sparta. Argos, in particular, recently defeated by Cleomenes, watched the passage of Spartan soldiers with wary eyes. But there was no hostility. The Persian threat had created strange alignments. The landscape changed as they moved north, becoming more lush. The harsh beauty of Laconia gave way to gentler valleys, more abundant water, richer soil. They reached Corinth on the third day and paused to rest and resupply. The city bustled with activity, sitting at the crossroads of Greece. Leonidas met with Corinthian leadership, coordinating plans, confirming commitments of support. The Corinthians would contribute ships to the fleet and soldiers to defense, though some forces would be held back to defend the isthmus if Thermopylae failed. It was pragmatic, if not entirely comforting. Everyone was hedging bets. Leaving Corinth, they crossed the isthmus itself, that narrow strip where some argued defense should be made. Leonidas examined it with professional eye. It was defensible, a good place to make a stand if Thermopylae failed. But it was also surrender of everything north of it, a line drawn that left too much of Greece to Persian mercy. Beyond the isthmus, they entered Attica, land of Athens. Here signs of war preparation were everywhere. The Athenians were evacuating their city, sending women and children to safety, while men prepared to board the fleet. It was desperate measure, abandoning homes in hopes of saving freedom. Themistocles came to meet Leonidas as his force passed through. They spoke briefly, confirming coordinated strategy. The fleet would sail for Artemisium to engage the Persian navy. Timing was crucial. Both forces needed to be in position simultaneously. "The winds favor us," Themistocles said, gesturing toward clouds. "A storm may slow the Persian fleet. Give us time." Leonidas nodded. "We will be ready at Thermopylae." "How long can you keep their ships engaged?" "As long as necessary," Themistocles replied. "As long as you hold the pass." It was a pact sealed with mutual understanding. 2 men, 2 cities, 2 parts of a single strategy, each dependent on the other. If either failed, all would be lost. Continuing north through Boeotia, the reality of Persian advance became more immediate. Refugees clogged roads, families fleeing south with whatever they could carry. The stories they told were terrifying. An army so vast it darkened the horizon, so numerous that rivers ran dry where they drank. Leonidas listened with calm attention. Exaggeration was natural in such circumstances, but even allowing for embellishment, the picture was clear. Xerxes had brought unprecedented power to bear on Greece. The march continued through increasingly dramatic landscapes. Mountains rose on either side, channeling them toward their destination. The sea appeared to the east, the Malian Gulf stretching toward the horizon. And then, on the 7th day, they arrived at Thermopylae. The pass was even more impressive than reports suggested. To the south rose steep mountains, slopes of Mount Kallidromos, too rough for an army to cross. To the north, the sea pressed close, leaving only a narrow strip of land between water and mountain. At its narrowest point, the pass was scarcely wide enough for a single cart. This was the ground they would defend, this sliver of earth where geography would be their ally. Leonidas walked the length of the pass, studying it with the eye of a soldier who would soon stake everything on understanding it perfectly. There were 3 constrictions, 3 places where the pass was especially narrow. The middle gate, where ancient walls had once stood, offered the strongest defensive position. But Leonidas's attention was drawn to something troubling. Local guides pointed out a mountain path, the Thermopylae trail, that wound through the heights above the pass. It was narrow and difficult, but a force could use it to bypass the main position and descend behind the defenders. This was a vulnerability, a way for the Greeks to be outflanked. Leonidas immediately detailed a contingent of Phocians, locals who knew the terrain, to guard this path. They were to hold it at all costs to ensure no Persian force could use it to turn the Greek position. With reconnaissance complete, Leonidas ordered construction of defensive works. The old wall at the middle gate was repaired and strengthened, creating a physical barrier across the pass. Positions were prepared, supplies organized, water sources secured. The men worked with purpose, understanding that every stone placed might mean the difference between holding and breaking. As they worked, the fleet sailed into view, hundreds of Greek ships making for Artemisium. It was heartening, proof they were not alone in this fight. Signal fires were established to allow communication between land and sea forces, a way to coordinate actions even across distance. That night, with defensive preparations underway, Leonidas gathered his commanders in a simple tent. They sat on the ground in a circle, lamplight casting shadows on their faces. He wanted everyone to understand the plan, each unit to know its role. "The Persians will come in overwhelming numbers," he said. "They will expect us to break, to flee. We will not. We hold this pass, no matter what comes. The fleet needs time, Greece needs time, and we will give it to them." He assigned positions. Spartans would hold the critical middle section, where fighting would be fiercest. Allies would support on flanks and rotate through the line to prevent exhaustion. Phocians would guard the mountain path, the crucial task of preventing encirclement. "How long must we hold?" a Thespian commander asked. Leonidas looked at him steadily. "As long as it takes. Days, weeks if necessary, until the fleet has done its work, until the strategic situation changes. We hold. That is all." The meeting continued into the night, working through logistics and contingencies. When commanders finally dispersed, Leonidas remained, alone with his thoughts. Tomorrow or the next day, the Persians would arrive. The waiting would end, and reality would begin. He stepped outside and looked up at the stars, brilliant away from city fires, scattered across the sky in eternal patterns. A soft sound made him turn. One of the 300 had approached, a younger man with sons waiting in Sparta. "My lord," the soldier said quietly, "is it true what they say? That we may not return from this place?" Leonidas studied the man's face, seeing there a need for honest answer. "We came here to do what is necessary. Whether we return depends on many things, but know this: every man here chose to come. Every man here understands what may be asked, and every man here will do his duty, whatever comes." The soldier nodded slowly. "My son, he is only 5. I want him to know." "He will know," Leonidas said with quiet certainty. "If the worst happens, he will know that his father stood at Thermopylae. He will know you did not yield, that you kept faith with Sparta. That is a legacy worth more than gold. That is something that will live in him and his children after him." The soldier's jaw tightened, emotion held in check by Spartan discipline. He gave a brief nod, then returned to his post. Leonidas watched him go, this ordinary man facing extraordinary circumstances with courage. In the morning, Leonidas woke before dawn. The camp was stirring. But there was a change in the air, a tension that had not been there before. Scouts had come during the night with news. The Persian vanguard had been sighted. They were perhaps a day's march away, maybe less. The time for preparation was over. Now came the waiting, that peculiar torture of soldiers who know battle is imminent, but cannot yet act. By midday, the first elements of the Persian army came into view. They appeared on the eastern horizon like a dark smudge, and as more arrived, the smudge grew, spreading across the land like shadow. The Greeks watched in silence as hour after hour passed, and still more Persians came, until it seemed the entire world was filling with them. The scale was beyond anything most had seen. The Persian force included not just soldiers, but an entire mobile civilization. Leonidas stood on the wall, watching this display of power with outward calm. Beside him, some allied commanders struggled to maintain composure. One, a Theban, spoke what several were thinking. "We cannot fight that. It is impossible." "We are not here to fight all of them," Leonidas replied quietly. "We are here to fight the ones who can fit in this pass. And that number we can match." The Persians made camp beyond the eastern entrance, a vast sprawl that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Their scouts approached the Greek position cautiously, observing defenses, counting numbers, assessing the situation. Leonidas made no move to stop them. Let them look. Let them report back to Xerxes what they saw. That night, the two armies camped within sight of each other. The Persian fires were like a city of light in the darkness, thousands upon thousands of flames. The Greek fires were few by comparison, but steady. The envoy arrived the next morning, riding into the Greek camp on a fine horse, accompanied by guards in elaborate armor. He was a Persian noble, accustomed to respect and deference. He looked around at Greek defenses with barely concealed contempt. Leonidas received him formally, standing before the defensive wall with senior officers around him. The envoy delivered his message with confidence of one who expects compliance. "The great king, Xerxes, lord of Asia, demands your surrender. Lay down your weapons, submit to his authority, and you will be shown mercy. Resist, and you will be destroyed." There was a moment of silence. Then Leonidas spoke, his voice carrying clearly, "Molon lebe." The phrase was simple, just two words in Greek. "Come and take them." The envoy's face darkened. "You do not understand the power you face. The great king has brought armies from every corner of his empire. You are a handful of men in a narrow pass. This is not courage, it is madness." "Perhaps," Leonidas said, "but it is our madness, our choice. We will not surrender. If Xerxes wants our weapons, he must come and take them from our dead hands." The envoy stared, trying to comprehend this refusal. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and rode back toward the Persian camp. The message had been delivered and the response given. There would be no more talking. As the envoy disappeared, one of the Spartans laughed, a short bark of amusement. He seemed surprised. "They always are," Leonidas said. "They cannot imagine why we refuse. To them, submission is wisdom, resistance is folly. They do not understand that some things are worth dying for." As evening approached, he gathered the entire force before the defensive wall. The sun was lowering toward western mountains, casting long shadows. The Greek soldiers stood in formations, thousands of men waiting to hear what their commander would say. Leonidas spoke without elevation, without grand gestures. His voice was calm, conversational almost, as if stating obvious truths. "Tomorrow the Persians will come. They will expect us to break, to run, to surrender our freedom without a fight. We will show them what free men can do. We will show them that courage and discipline can match numbers, that fighting for home and liberty gives strength, that slaves, no matter how numerous, cannot match. This is a good place to make our stand. The pass is narrow, the position strong. When the battle comes, remember your training. Hold the line. Trust the man beside you. Give them no opening. We are Greeks, and we do not yield." He paused, looking at the assembled faces. "Eat well tonight. Rest as you can. Tomorrow we show the world what we are made of." The speech ended, simple and direct. The men dispersed, and Leonidas was left standing before the wall as the sun continued its descent. Gorgo seemed present to him in that moment, her calm intelligence, her strength. He thought of their daughter, of the city itself, the valley he loved. All of it was behind him now, distant but present in every choice he made. He was here to protect it, to buy time with blood if necessary, to ensure that Sparta would continue, even if he didn't. The first stars appeared, and a cool breeze came off the sea, carrying the scent of salt and distance. The Persian camp glowed with countless fires, and between the two armies the pass waited, silent and patient, ready to become what it would become: a testing ground, a battlefield, a place of legend. Morning came softly to Thermopylae, the sun rising over the Malian Gulf and touching mountain peaks with gold. Mist clung to the sea, and the air was fresh and cool, not yet carrying the heat that would come later. It was a beautiful morning, peaceful, giving no hint of the violence that would soon visit this place. The Greek camp stirred with quiet efficiency. Men rose, performed morning rituals, ate simple breakfasts. There was little conversation, each man alone with his thoughts, preparing himself in whatever way his nature suggested. The Spartans moved through routines with mechanical precision, their discipline a shield against uncertainty. Leonidas stood on the defensive wall, watching the Persian camp begin to wake. Even at this distance, the scale was overwhelming. The waiting continued through the morning. The Persians were in no hurry. They had the advantage of numbers and could afford to take their time. Around midday, there was movement in their camp, a stirring that suggested preparation for battle. Leonidas called his commanders together for final coordination. "They will send someone to test us first," he predicted. "Probably the Medes or Scythians, vassals proving their worth. They will expect us to be impressed by numbers, to lose our nerve. We will show them otherwise." The commanders returned to their units, and the Greek force arranged itself for battle. The Spartans took the center, the place of honor and greatest danger. On the flanks, allied contingents positioned themselves. Behind them, reserves waited, prepared to step in when fatigue or casualties required fresh troops. The defensive wall stood before them, a barrier that would force the Persians to fight on Greek terms. Around mid-afternoon, the Persian advance began. Trumpets sounded across the plain, an echoing signal. The Greeks watched as the first wave assembled, thousands of soldiers in varied armor, carrying spears and bows, shields of wicker and hide. They came forward at a steady pace, filling the pass from mountain to sea. As they approached, they began to run, raising war cries, trying to intimidate through noise and numbers. It was an impressive display, and some allied troops shifted nervously. But the Spartans stood like statues, shields locked, spears leveled, silent. They had been trained for this moment from childhood, had drilled these formations thousands of times. The sight of charging enemies, however numerous, could not shake what years of discipline had instilled. Leonidas stood in the front rank, his position clearly marked, so the Persians would know where to find the Greek commander. It was a challenge and a statement. Here is your target. Come and take it if you can. The Persians reached the defensive wall and attempted to swarm over it. They had numbers, but numbers meant little when only a few men could attack at any given point. The Greeks met them with thrusting spears, stabbing from behind shields, using longer weapons to keep the enemy at distance. The sound was terrible. Bronze on bronze, screams of wounded men, the thud of bodies falling. The Persians pressed forward with courage, climbing over their own dead to reach the Greeks. But the phalanx held, each man protecting the man beside him. The formation maintaining integrity even under intense pressure. After perhaps an hour of continuous assault, the Persians fell back, leaving their dead piled before the wall. It had been a test, and they had failed it. The Greeks had held with relative ease, their casualties minimal, their formation unbroken. Leonidas allowed a brief rest, then rotated fresh troops to the front. This was the key to holding the pass, managing fatigue, ensuring that those in contact with the enemy were always at full strength. The Persians would tire themselves trying to break through, while the Greeks would maintain effectiveness through careful rotation. The second assault came an hour later, a different approach. This time the Persians tried to use archers, sending volleys of arrows into the Greek position. But the Greeks simply raised their shields, creating a roof of bronze that deflected most missiles. A few men were hit, mostly in legs or feet, but it was not enough to break the formation. Then the Persian infantry came again, trying to exploit any gaps the arrows might have created. Again they were met by locked shields and thrusting spears of the phalanx. Again they broke against it, like waves against a cliff. Again they fell back with heavy losses. As the afternoon wore on, the pattern repeated. The Persians would assault, the Greeks would hold, casualties would mount on the Persian side, while the Greeks remained relatively intact. It was not that the Persians lacked courage. They fought bravely, throwing themselves against Greek lines with determination. But courage without discipline was not enough against men who had made discipline their entire way of life. Between assaults, the Greeks worked quickly to clear bodies, tend to wounded, redistribute weapons. The Spartans moved with calm efficiency, showing no triumph or excitement, simply doing what needed to be done. Leonidas watched it all with professional attention. He noted how different Persian units fought, which tactics they tried, where their formations showed weakness. He adjusted Greek positions accordingly, always looking for ways to maximize advantages. As evening approached, the Persians withdrew entirely, returning to their camp to regroup. The first day of battle was over, and the Greeks had held. The pass remained in their control. The Persian advance completely stopped. That night there was quiet satisfaction in the Greek camp. They had proven that the Persians could be held, that numbers alone would not determine the outcome. Men tended to minor wounds, repaired damaged equipment, and ate their evening meal with knowledge that they had done well. Leonidas walked among them, offering words of encouragement, noting who had fought with particular skill or courage. He knew this was only the beginning, that Xerxes would try different approaches, would bring more pressure to bear. But for now, they had held, and that was enough. The second day followed a similar pattern. The Persians came in waves, trying different combinations of troops and tactics. They sent their immortals, the elite Persian guard, said to be the finest soldiers in the empire. But even these renowned warriors could not break the Greek phalanx in the narrow pass. The immortals were skilled and disciplined, better equipped and better trained than troops who had come before. They pressed the Greeks harder, forcing them to fight with full intensity. But the fundamental mathematics of the situation didn't change. Only a certain number of Persians could engage at any one time, and that number was roughly equal to the Greek front line. In such close quarters, the Greek advantage in armor and weapons told. Persian wicker shields could not stop Greek spears. Lighter Persian armor could not turn aside Greek thrusts, and the Greek formation, perfected over generations, proved superior to Persian tactics that relied more on individual skill than collective coordination. By the end of the second day, the pass was choked with Persian dead. The Greeks had lost some men, but their casualties were a fraction of what the Persians had suffered. If this continued, if the mathematics remained favorable, the Greeks might actually win, might hold the pass until the Persians gave up, or the strategic situation changed. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. On the third morning, as the sun rose over a battlefield already marked by 2 days of slaughter, Leonidas sensed something had changed. The Persian camp showed unusual activity, movements that suggested new strategy. He stood on the defensive wall, watching, his experienced eye noting patterns that troubled him. What Leonidas could not see was what had happened in the darkness of the previous night. A local man, a Greek from the nearby town of Trachis, had made his way to the Persian camp. His name was Ephialtes, and he carried information that would change everything. He knew about the mountain path, the Anopaia trail that could bypass the Greek position. For a promised reward, he offered to guide the Persians along this route. Xerxes, frustrated by his inability to break through the main pass, seized on this opportunity. He detailed a large force under the command of Hydarnes, a trusted general, to follow Ephialtes through the mountains. They set out after dark, moving quietly through the night, climbing the difficult path that would bring them down behind the Greek position. The Phocians guarding the trail heard them coming in the pre-dawn darkness, but they had been posted there for days with no action, and their vigilance had perhaps waned. The Persians came upon them suddenly, appearing out of the darkness in numbers the Phocians could not match. There was a brief fight, but the Phocians, realizing they were outnumbered and outflanked, withdrew to higher ground rather than be destroyed. It was a practical decision, but it left the path open. The Persians continued their descent, moving toward the western exit of the pass, toward the rear of the Greek position. A Phocian runner brought the news to Leonidas just as dawn was breaking. The mountain path had been turned. The Persians were descending. The Greek position was about to be surrounded. It was the nightmare scenario, the vulnerability that Leonidas had worried about from the beginning. He gathered his commanders quickly, assessing the situation with the calm that had always characterized his leadership. If the Persians completed their flanking movement, the entire Greek force would be trapped, surrounded, and destroyed. The only option was withdrawal, to retreat while there was still time, to save the army to fight another day. But withdrawal meant abandoning the pass, meant that the entire purpose of the mission, buying time for the fleet and for Greece, would be lost. And there was the oracle's prophecy, those cryptic words about Sparta's survival and a king's death, words that Leonidas had carried with him since the beginning. He made his choice with the clarity that had always defined him. The bulk of the force would withdraw immediately before the trap closed. They would retreat south, preserving their strength for future battles. But someone had to hold the pass, had to delay the Persians long enough for the withdrawal to succeed, long enough to extract every possible moment of time from this desperate situation. The Spartans would stay, along with the Thespians, who refused to abandon them, and the Thebans, who were kept as much from distrust as from need. Orders were given quickly, and the withdrawal began. Most of the Allied contingents, grateful for the reprieve, gathered their equipment and began moving west, hurrying to get clear before the Persian flanking force cut them off. Leonidas watched them go, these men who had fought bravely for days, who had held the line when it seemed impossible. He bore them no ill will for leaving. They had done their duty, had given Greece precious time. Now they would live to fight again, and that was important too. But the 300 Spartans remained, and with them about 700 Thespians who, when given the chance to withdraw, simply refused. "We came here to fight beside Spartans," their commander said quietly. "We will not leave while Spartans remain." It was a gesture that moved even the laconic Leonidas. These men from a small city, with everything to lose and little to gain, were choosing to stay, to die, if necessary, out of pure courage and solidarity. They would be remembered, he vowed silently. Their names would be honored alongside the Spartans. The Thebans stayed too, though with less enthusiasm. Some suspected they were kept as hostages against Theban treachery. Whatever the reason, they would share the fate of the others. As the morning advanced, Leonidas and his remaining force prepared for what they all knew would come. The mathematics had changed. Before, they had been holding a position. Now they were buying time with their lives, extracting every minute possible for their retreating comrades, for Greece, for the future. The men made their final preparations in silence. They checked armor one last time, said private prayers to their gods, thought of homes and families they would not see again. The Spartans showed no outward emotion, but they were still human, still felt the weight of what was coming. Leonidas moved among them, speaking briefly with each man. He wanted them to know they were seen, that their sacrifice would not be forgotten, that what they were about to do mattered more than anything they had done before. One of the 300, a man named Dionysus, was told by a Trachinian that the Persian arrows would be so numerous they would block out the sun. Dionysus laughed and said, "Good, then we shall have our battle in the shade." It was pure Spartan humor, facing death with a jest, refusing to let fear have the final word. As the sun climbed higher, the Persians came from the east as they had before. But now they came with new confidence, knowing that their flanking force was descending, knowing that the Greeks were trapped. The morning assault was fierce, wave after wave crashing against the Greek position. But still the Greeks held. Still they fought with the same discipline and ferocity they had shown from the beginning. Leonidas fought in the front rank, his position unmistakable. He wanted the Persians to see him, to know that the Spartan king had not fled, that he stood with his men to the end. His spear thrust and withdrew, each movement economical and deadly. Around him, the 300 fought as they had been trained to fight, as one body with many parts, perfect in their coordination, even as death closed in from all sides. The battle became timeless, a continuous present where past and future ceased to matter, where there was only the next thrust, the next shield block, the next heartbeat in the diminishing space between life and death. Then word came that the Persian flanking force had completed its descent, was approaching from the west. The trap was closing. Leonidas gave the order to fall back to a small hill within the pass, a final defensive position. They withdrew in good order, still maintaining formation, still making the Persians pay for every advance. On the hill, with enemies now coming from both directions, the Greeks formed a circle, shields facing outward. It was the last stand, the final act of the drama that had been playing out for days. The Spartans and Thespians stood side by side, brothers in arms facing the end with the courage that had defined them throughout. The Thebans, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, broke away and surrendered to the Persians. Leonidas watched them go without comment. Each man had to make his own choice in the face of death. The Thebans had chosen survival, and he would not judge them for it. But the Spartans and Thespians stood firm. The Persians surrounded the hilltop, where the Greeks had made their final stand. From every direction they came, a tide of humanity pressing in on the small circle of defenders. The sun was high now, beating down on bronze armor and upturned faces, on the living and the dead that already littered the ground. Leonidas stood at the center of the formation, his shield battered, his armor dented from impacts, but his bearing still regal, still commanding. Around him, The 300 had been reduced by the morning's fighting. Some had fallen, others were wounded but still standing, leaning on spears, refusing to yield while breath remained. The Thespians, true to their word, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans. 700 had stayed, and now perhaps half remained. But those who lived fought with a fury born of knowing their choice, of having willingly walked into this end. The Persians began their assault on the hill, coming from all sides, trying to overwhelm the Greeks through sheer weight of numbers. But even now, even in this desperate final moment, the phalanx held. The Greeks fought not in panic or desperation, but with the same disciplined precision that had marked their stand from the beginning. Spears thrust out from the shield wall, finding Persian flesh, withdrawing, thrusting again. When spears broke, the Greeks drew their short swords, the xyphos, and fought on. When swords broke or were lost, they fought with whatever came to hand, with shields as weapons, with stones, with their bare hands if necessary. Leonidas's spear had long since shattered. He fought now with his sword, the blade red with Persian blood, his movements still controlled despite exhaustion, despite wounds he had taken. A Persian arrow had struck his leg, another had grazed his shoulder, but he barely noticed. There was only the fight, only the need to hold for one more moment, to buy one more heartbeat of time. Around him, his men were falling. Dionysus, who had joked about fighting in the shade, went down under a storm of arrows, still laughing as he fell. Alpheus and Maron, the twin brothers who had insisted on serving together, died within moments of each other, each reaching out toward the other as they collapsed. The hill was becoming slippery with blood, making footing treacherous. Bodies of friend and foe alike covered the ground, creating obstacles that the living had to fight over and around. The air was thick with the smell of blood and sweat, with the sounds of men dying, with the cacophony of battle that seemed to fill the entire world. Leonidas felt his strength beginning to fail, not from fear or loss of will, but simply from the physical toll of hours of continuous combat. His arms were heavy, his breathing labored. He knew the end was coming, could feel it approaching like nightfall, inevitable and final. A Persian spear caught him in the side, slipping between plates of armor, finding flesh. The pain was sharp, immediate, stealing his breath. He stumbled, caught himself, fought on. Another blow, this time to his chest, and he felt something vital give way inside him. He fell to his knees, still trying to raise his sword, still trying to defend, to hold, to buy one more moment. The Spartans around him surged forward, forming a protective ring around their fallen king, fighting with renewed fury to shield him, even in death. The battle raged over Leonidas's body as the last of the Spartans and Thespians made their stand. They fought not for victory now, not even for survival, but simply because they were warriors, and this was what warriors did. They fought because to do anything else would be to betray everything they were, everything they had been shaped to be. One by one, they fell. Some were cut down in the midst of dealing blows to the enemy. Others fell to arrows, shot from a distance by Persians who had learned to respect the deadliness of Greek close combat. The circle grew smaller, tighter, as the defenders diminished. The last Spartan, surrounded by the bodies of his companions, fought on alone for precious seconds before he too was overwhelmed, disappearing beneath a wave of Persian soldiers. And then it was over. The hill fell silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the Persians who had finally, at terrible cost, taken the position. When the Persians pulled back to assess their victory, they found among the dead the body of Leonidas. Even in death, he seemed to command respect, his face composed, his weapons still in his hands. Xerxes, when he came to view the battlefield, was said to have ordered Leonidas's head taken and his body crucified, a rare dishonor for the Persian king to bestow, born perhaps of grudging respect for a foe who had cost him so dearly. The pass was taken. The Persians could advance. But they had been delayed for 3 crucial days, and in those 3 days everything had changed. The Greek fleet, fighting at Artemisium, had inflicted significant damage on the Persian navy. The evacuation of Athens was complete. The Greek states had rallied, inspired by the stand at Thermopylae. Most importantly, the Persians had learned something about the Greeks they faced. They had learned that these people would not easily submit, that they valued freedom more than life, that a few men fighting for the right cause in the right place could exact a terrible price from even the mightiest empire. As the sun set on the 3rd day of battle, on the hill where Leonidas and his men had made their stand, the only movement was the wind stirring crimson cloaks that would never again march in formation, that would never again return to Sparta. But the story of what happened there, the tale of courage and sacrifice, was just beginning its journey through time. The battlefield at Thermopylae lay quiet in the aftermath, a silence broken only by the wind moving across the pass and the distant sound of the sea against the shore. The Persian army, having finally broken through, began the grim work of tending to their own dead and wounded. The losses had been staggering, far beyond anything Xerxes had anticipated for a simple mountain pass. The Greek dead lay where they had fallen, on the hill that had been their final stand, scattered along the defensive wall, marking the line they had held for 3 impossible days. The Spartans in their crimson cloaks were easy to identify, their bodies often surrounded by Persian dead, testament to the price they had extracted even in dying. The Thespians lay among them, honored by their proximity to the Spartans, having earned through their courage a place in a story that would outlive empires. Their small city would be remembered because of what 700 of her sons had done in this narrow pass, choosing to stand with Sparta when they could have fled. The Greeks who had withdrawn carried the tale south with them. They spoke of Leonidas's final command, of the Spartans who had stayed, of the Thespians who had refused to leave. The story spread through Greece like wildfire, transforming grief into something else, something stronger. The loss became a rallying cry, proof that Persians could be resisted, that freedom was worth any price. In Sparta, the news arrived with a messenger who had been with the withdrawing forces. He came travel-stained and weary, bearing words that every Spartan had known might come, but hoped would not. Gorgo received the news with the composure expected of a Spartan queen. She stood straight, her face calm, and listened as the messenger described how Leonidas had sent the others away, how he had stayed with the 300, how they had fought to the last man. When the messenger finished, Gorgo nodded once. "He did what was necessary," she said simply. Then she dismissed the messenger and turned to the duties of a widow and a queen, to ensuring that the city her husband had died to protect would continue strong. The 300 had been chosen specifically because they had sons, because their family lines would continue. Now those sons, young boys who had bid their fathers farewell, learned that they would not return. They learned it in the Spartan way, with brief words and no false comfort, told that their fathers had died well, had brought honor to their names and to Sparta. In the Agoge, where some of these boys were already in training, the story of Thermopylae became part of the curriculum, not taught from scrolls, but related by veterans who had fought there, who had been among those Leonidas sent away. The boys learned every detail, how the phalanx had held, how the rotations had worked, how discipline had trumped numbers. But more than tactics, they learned about choice. They learned that Leonidas could have withdrawn everyone, could have preserved his own life and the lives of the 300. They learned that he had chosen instead to buy time, to give Greece a chance, to make a sacrifice that would echo through the ages. The Persian army moved south, but their advance was slower now, more cautious. They had learned to respect Greek warriors, to understand that every battle would be costly. At Artemisium, the Greek fleet had fought the Persians to a tactical draw before withdrawing, the Spartan sacrifice at Thermopylae giving them time to inflict damage and escape. Athens was evacuated when the Persians arrived, the city empty of all but a few defenders on the Acropolis. Xerxes took the city and burned it, but it was a hollow victory. The Athenians were not defeated, merely displaced, their fleet intact, their will to resist unbroken. Then came Salamis, where Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into narrow waters and destroyed it. The tactics he used bore echoes of Thermopylae. Use geography to neutralize numbers, force the enemy to fight on your terms, make them pay dearly for every advance. The ghost of Leonidas seemed to hover over that battle, his lesson learned and applied. After Salamis, Xerxes withdrew, leaving his general Mardonius to complete the conquest. But the momentum had shifted. The Greeks, inspired by Thermopylae and Salamis, united as never before. The following year, at Plataea, the combined Greek armies met the Persians in open battle and destroyed them utterly. Mardonius fell in the fighting, and with him fell Persian hopes of conquering Greece. The invasion that had seemed unstoppable, that had crossed the Hellespont with such confidence, limped back to Asia in defeat. And when Greeks spoke of what had turned the tide, they spoke of Thermopylae, of Leonidas, of the 300 who had shown what was possible. In the years that followed, the Greeks erected a monument at Thermopylae. It was simple, in the Spartan style, no elaborate artwork or lengthy inscription. Just a stone lion for Leonidas, the lion named King, and words that captured everything in characteristic Spartan brevity. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie. The lion stood sentinel over the pass, weathering seasons and centuries, a marker of where courage had made its stand. Travelers would stop there, would read the inscription, would imagine what it must have been like. 300 men facing an empire, choosing death over surrender. The hill where they made their final stand became sacred ground. No battle was ever fought there again, as if by mutual agreement all who came after understood that some places are hallowed by what happened there, that some ground is too sacred for ordinary use. Leonidas's name spread beyond Greece. Even the Persians spoke of him with respect, this king who had stood in their path and refused to move. In Persian accounts, he became a figure of admiration, an enemy, yes, but one worthy of honor, a reminder that courage exists in all peoples, that the human spirit cannot be measured by the size of armies. The 300 were remembered individually in Sparta. Their names were recorded, their deeds recounted. Each family treasured the memory of the father or son who had stood at Thermopylae. It became the highest honor a Spartan family could claim, to say that one of their own had been among the 300, had stood with Leonidas in the pass. The Thespians, too, were honored, their city's name preserved by their sacrifice. Though Thespiae was small and would eventually fade from prominence, the 700 who stayed at Thermopylae ensured their people would never be forgotten. Monuments were raised to them, and their courage was celebrated alongside that of the Spartans. In the broader Greek world, Thermopylae became shorthand for resistance against impossible odds. When cities faced threats, when armies stood outnumbered, someone would invoke Thermopylae, would remind their compatriots of what Leonidas had done, of what could be accomplished through courage and unity. Poets sang of the battle, transforming it from historical event into legend. Simonides, the great lyric poet, composed verses that would be memorized by generations. Of those who died at Thermopylae, glorious is the fortune, fair the fate. Their tomb is an altar, for lamentation they have remembrance, for pity praise. Such a winding sheet neither decay nor all-conquering time shall ruin. This sepulchre of brave men has taken for guardian the honor of Greece. The words captured something essential, that death in such a cause was not tragedy, but triumph, that memory could conquer mortality, that some deeds transcend the moment and become eternal. As years passed and Greece entered new phases of its history, through the Peloponnesian War and the rise of Macedon, through conquest by Alexander and absorption into Rome, Thermopylae remained a touchstone. Every Greek knew the story, could recite the basic facts, understood what it meant about their heritage. When the Romans came to dominate the Mediterranean world, they too were struck by the tale. Roman historians recorded it. Roman generals studied it for tactical lessons. Roman philosophers used it to illustrate principles of duty and sacrifice. The story crossed cultures, languages, and time itself. The physical pass changed over centuries. The sea receded, earthquakes altered the landscape, and the narrow defile that had once been perfect for defense became wider, less dramatic. But the memory remained fixed, eternal, immune to the changes that affected mere geography. In Sparta itself, as the city eventually declined from its position of dominance, as the unique Spartan system finally gave way to time and change, Thermopylae became even more important. It represented what Sparta had been at its height, the pure expression of Spartan values, the moment when everything the city stood for was perfectly embodied in 300 men and their king. Gorgo lived many years after Leonidas's death. She never remarried, despite his final words giving her permission. She raised their daughter, managed the royal estates, and when people asked about her husband, she spoke of him simply, without elaborate praise or excessive grief. He did what was necessary, she would say, and in those words was everything. Acceptance and pride mingled together. The daughter of Leonidas and Gorgo grew up in the shadow of her father's fame, but also in the light of it. She married well, and through her the line of Leonidas continued, his blood flowing through generations of Spartans, a living connection to that moment in the past. In time, the story of Thermopylae became separated from its specific historical context. People forgot the details of Persian wars, lost track of why Xerxes had invaded, confused the timeline of battles. But they remembered Leonidas, remembered the 300, remembered that once, in a narrow place between mountain and sea, free men had stood against an empire and refused to yield. The tale spread beyond the Mediterranean world. As Greek culture influenced Rome and Rome influenced Europe, the story traveled with it. Medieval knights heard of Thermopylae and saw in it a mirror of their own ideals. Renaissance scholars rediscovered the ancient texts and marveled at the courage they described. In every age, people found in Thermopylae something that spoke to their own struggles. The details might change, the context might shift, but the core remained constant. The story of those who stand against overwhelming odds, who choose principle over survival, who demonstrate that the human spirit cannot be conquered by mere numbers. The wind continued to blow through the pass at Thermopylae, as it had blown on that third day of battle, as it would blow for all the days to come. It moved across the stone lion, across the hill where the final stand had been made, across the graves of heroes. And in that wind, if one listened carefully, one might almost hear the echo of the paean, that battle hymn the Spartans sang as they advanced, that measured rhythmic chant that had sounded for the last time on a summer day 2,500 years ago. The silence after the storm was not empty. It was filled with memory, with meaning, with the understanding that what happened there mattered, that it would always matter, that as long as there were people who valued freedom over slavery, courage over cowardice, duty over ease, the story of Thermopylae would endure. To understand what Leonidas accomplished, one must look beyond the tactical details of the battle, beyond the count of dead and the measurement of days. The stand at Thermopylae was more than a military action. It was a statement about human nature, about what people are capable of when they have something worth dying for. The Persians had expected the Greeks to behave rationally, as the Persians understood rationality. They expected surrender in the face of overwhelming force, submission when resistance seemed futile. They had conquered much of the known world through this assumption, through the belief that people, when confronted with the choice between slavery and death, would choose life. But Leonidas and his men operated from a different understanding of rationality. To them, freedom was not negotiable. Honor was not a luxury to be abandoned when convenient, and some things were indeed worse than death. Slavery was worse. Submission was worse. Living as less than free men was worse. This was not mere bravado or theatrical courage. It was a deeply held conviction, instilled from childhood, reinforced through every day of training and every moment of Spartan life. The Agog had not just built strong bodies, it had created minds that could conceive of sacrifice as victory, that could see meaning in defeat, that could transform mortality into immortality through the power of principled action. When Leonidas told the Persian envoy to come and take their weapons, when he led his men in that final stand, he was not being defiant for the sake of defiance. He was stating a fundamental truth about human dignity, that it cannot be given away, cannot be sold, can only be surrendered voluntarily or taken by force. And if someone attempts to take it by force, they will pay a price. The price the Persians paid at Thermopylae was not measured only in casualties, though those were substantial. It was measured in time, in momentum, in the psychological impact of discovering that conquest of Greece would not be easy. Every hour that Leonidas held the pass was an hour for the Greek fleet to maneuver, for Athens to evacuate, for the scattered Greek cities to overcome their differences and unite. But beyond these practical considerations was something more profound. Thermopylae demonstrated that numbers are not destiny, that power does not automatically translate into victory, that the will to resist can be as potent as the might brought to bear against it. This lesson resonated far beyond the immediate circumstances of the Persian invasion. Throughout history, people facing oppression have looked to Thermopylae and found inspiration, not because they expected to win necessarily, but because they learned that resistance itself has value, that the act of standing up matters regardless of the outcome. Leonidas did not defeat the Persian Empire at Thermopylae. He delayed it for 3 days. But in those 3 days, he changed what was possible. The Spartan system that created Leonidas and his 300 was deeply flawed. It rested on the slavery of the helots, on a militarism that stunted other aspects of human development, on a rigidity that eventually proved its undoing. But within that flawed system, it produced men capable of extraordinary deeds, men who had so thoroughly internalized certain values that they could act on them without hesitation, even unto death. This raises uncomfortable questions. Can we celebrate the courage while condemning the system that produced it? Can we find inspiration in Thermopylae while acknowledging the injustice that made Sparta possible? Perhaps the answer is that we can and must do both, that the complexity of history does not allow for simple judgments. Leonidas himself was a product of his time and culture. He owned slaves, participated in a system of oppression, accepted without question many things that we would rightly condemn. But he also embodied virtues that transcend their cultural context: courage, leadership, sacrifice, the willingness to pay personally for principles he held. When we remember Thermopylae, we are not endorsing everything about Sparta. We are recognizing a moment when human courage reached a kind of apex, when men faced the ultimate test and did not flinch, when the idea of freedom proved more powerful than the reality of empire. The legacy of Leonidas is complicated by this duality. He is a hero, yes, but a hero from a world very different from our own, holding some values we share and others we reject. Yet the core of what he did, the essential act of standing against overwhelming odds for the sake of something greater than himself, remains inspiring across the centuries. In the end, perhaps what Thermopylae teaches us is not about Sparta specifically, or even about ancient Greece, but about the human capacity for courage. It shows us that ordinary people, when shaped by belief and united in purpose, can accomplish extraordinary things. It demonstrates that the willingness to sacrifice, to put something larger than oneself first, is a power that cannot be defeated by mere numbers. The 300 Spartans were not superhuman. They felt fear, they felt pain, they knew they were going to die. But they had been trained to act despite fear, to endure despite pain, to face death with equanimity. And in doing so, they achieved a kind of immortality that all the kings of Persia, with all their power, could never attain. When we tell the story of Thermopylae, we are doing more than recounting history. We are affirming that courage matters, that sacrifice has meaning, that free people defending their freedom can never be truly defeated. We are saying that there are things worth dying for, principles worth preserving, even at the ultimate cost. Leonidas understood this. In those final moments on the hill, surrounded by his dying men, knowing that his own death was imminent, he must have known that what they were doing would echo through time. Not because they had won a victory in the conventional sense, but because they had demonstrated something timeless about the human spirit. The silence that fell over Thermopylae after the battle was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of completion, of a task fulfilled, of men who had done what they set out to do. They had held the pass as long as possible. They had bought the time that Greece needed. They had shown the world what free men could do. And in that silence, in the wind moving across the battlefield, in the waves breaking against the shore, there was a kind of peace. The peace that comes from knowing that one's life had meaning, that one's death served a purpose, that the struggle, however brief, however costly, had been worth it. Time moves on, indifferent to human affairs, wearing away stone and memory alike. Empires rise and fall, languages change and die, and the very landscape transforms under the patient work of wind and water. Yet some stories persist, defying entropy, passing from generation to generation, altered perhaps in details, but preserved in essence. The story of Leonidas and Thermopylae is one such tale. For over 2,000 years it has been told and retold, each age finding in it something relevant to its own struggles, each culture adapting it to its own needs, yet the core remaining recognizable, imperishable. In the centuries immediately following the battle, the story served a political purpose. The Greek city-states, often divided by rivalry and conflict, could unite around the memory of Thermopylae. Here was proof that Greeks, when threatened by outside forces, could put aside their differences and stand together. The 300 became symbols of pan-Hellenic unity, evidence that Greek freedom was worth defending. When Alexander the Great marched east to conquer the Persian Empire, he carried with him the memory of Thermopylae. His father, Philip, had united Greece, partly by invoking the Persian threat, by reminding Greeks of Xerxes' invasion and the courage it had taken to resist. Alexander himself made a point of visiting the battlefield, of paying respects to those who had died there, using the past to justify and inspire his present conquest. The Romans, when they came to dominate Greece, found in Thermopylae a mirror of their own values. Roman writers like Cicero and Plutarch recorded the tale, emphasizing the virtues of duty, discipline, and sacrifice that Rome claimed to embody. The story crossed from Greek into Latin, from one culture to another, proving its universal appeal. In the medieval period, when the texts of ancient Greece were preserved in monasteries and studied by scholars, Thermopylae became an example for Christian knights. Here was a model of righteous warriors fighting against impossible odds, sacrificing themselves for a greater good. The details of pagan religion were glossed over. The essential story of courage and faith remained. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical learning brought renewed interest in Thermopylae. Scholars pored over the accounts of Herodotus and other ancient historians. Artists depicted the battle in paintings and sculptures, and the educated elite of Europe could quote Simonides' epitaph in the original Greek. It became a touchstone of classical education, a story every educated person was expected to know. In the age of revolutions, when the American colonies fought for independence from Britain and the French overthrew their monarchy, Thermopylae took on new significance. Here was an ancient precedent for resisting tyranny, for valuing liberty over life, for standing against overwhelming power in defense of principle. The founding fathers of the United States referenced Sparta and Thermopylae. French revolutionaries invoked the ancient Greeks as they fought for equality and liberty. The 19th century, with its romantic nationalism, embraced Thermopylae enthusiastically. Nations seeking independence or unity found inspiration in the tale. Greeks fighting against Ottoman rule explicitly connected their struggle to the ancient resistance against Persia. Italians, Germans, Poles, all peoples seeking self-determination, looked to Thermopylae as validation of their cause. In the 20th century, with its world wars and struggles against totalitarianism, the story continued to resonate. Those fighting fascism and communism saw parallels in the stand against Persian imperialism. The image of a small force holding against overwhelming odds became a metaphor for resistance movements, for those who refused to submit to tyranny regardless of the cost. But the story was also misused, appropriated by causes that Leonidas might not have recognized or approved. Authoritarian regimes invoked Spartan discipline and sacrifice while ignoring Spartan freedom. Militaristic societies celebrated the 300 while forgetting that they fought for something beyond mere martial glory. The tale became a tool, shaped and reshaped by those who sought to use it for their own purposes. Yet through all these interpretations and misinterpretations, through all the uses and abuses, the essential story survived. And that story, stripped of political manipulation and cultural overlay, remains powerful. It is about people choosing to do what they believe is right, even when it costs them everything. About the conviction that some principles are worth dying for. About the power of courage in the face of fear. In the modern world, where Thermopylae itself has become a tourist destination, where buses bring visitors to stand where Leonidas stood, where the geography has changed so much that it is hard to imagine the original battle, the story persists. People come from around the world to see the monument, to read the inscription, to try to understand what happened there. Some come as students of history, seeking to understand the tactics and strategy, to analyze what Leonidas did, right and wrong, to place the battle in its proper context. Others come as pilgrims of sorts, seeking connection to something larger than themselves, wanting to stand on ground where courage was tested and not found wanting. The stone lion still watches over the pass, weathered now, eroded by time, but still recognizable. The inscription remains legible. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. These words, composed in the immediate aftermath of the battle, have outlasted the city they commemorate, have survived the civilization that produced them, have echoed down through 25 centuries of human history. Modern Greece claims Thermopylae as part of its heritage, connecting the current nation to its ancient past through this story. School children learn about Leonidas, visit the battlefield on field trips, absorb the tale as part of their national identity. It is a bridge across millennia, linking modern Greeks to their ancestors, providing continuity in a world of change. But the story belongs not just to Greece, but to all of humanity. It speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, the tension between self-preservation and principle, between the individual and the collective, between the immediate and the eternal. Leonidas, facing his final moments, made a choice that billions of people across the centuries have contemplated. What would I do in that situation? Would I have the courage to stand? Most of us will never face such a test. We will live our lives without having to choose between freedom and death, without standing in a mountain pass against an empire. But we face smaller versions of that choice all the time, moments when we must decide between the easy path and the right one, when we must choose between self-interest and principle, when we must stand alone for something we believe in. And in those moments, the echo of Thermopylae can still be heard, faint but clear, a voice from the past saying that courage is possible, that principle can prevail, that the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than oneself is not foolishness, but the highest form of wisdom. The story endures because it offers something every age needs, proof that human beings are capable of nobility, that we can rise above our fears and limitations, that we can, when necessary, be heroes. Not superhuman, not perfect, but human beings choosing to act with courage and honor even in the face of certain death. Leonidas has been dead for more than 2,000 years. Sparta is ruins, the Persian Empire is dust, and the Greece he knew has vanished into history. But the story of what he did, of the choice he made, of the 300 who stood with him, lives on. It lives in books and in memory, in monuments and in minds, in the continuing human struggle to understand what courage means and what is worth dying for. As long as there are people who value freedom, as long as there are those who believe that some principles transcend survival, as long as courage is needed in the world, the story of Thermopylae will be told. And Leonidas, the quiet Spartan king who never sought glory but achieved immortality, will continue to speak across the centuries, his message simple and eternal. Stand for what is right, no matter the cost. Night falls gently over the pass at Thermopylae, as it has fallen every evening for millennia. The tourists have departed. The buses have carried away their cargo of curious visitors, and the memorial site is quiet once more. The sea whispers against the shore. The mountains stand in silhouette against the stars, and the wind moves softly through the place where heroes made their stand. If you were to stand there in that darkness, on that sacred ground, you might feel the presence of the past, not as something distant and academic, but as something immediate and alive, a current running beneath the surface of things, connecting that ancient day to this present moment, linking those who died long ago to those who live now. The stone lion keeps its eternal watch, patient as the mountains, enduring as the sea. In the darkness, its features are softened, less monument than memory made visible, a marker of where something important happened, something that mattered then and matters still. Leonidas sleeps there, in a sense, not in the literal ground, for his body was never properly buried in this place, but in the memory that has soaked into the earth, into the stones, into the very air of Thermopylae. He sleeps the sleep of those who have completed their task, who have done what they were born to do, who can rest, knowing that their work endures. With him sleep the 300, each one an individual, each one a man with a name, a family, a life left behind. They sleep side by side with the 700 Thespians who chose to stand with them, bound together in death as they were in that final battle. Brothers not by blood, but by choice, by courage, by the shared willingness to pay the ultimate price. Their sleep is peaceful, for they have earned peace. They did not seek death, did not welcome it, but when it came, they faced it without flinching, without regret, without surrender. They bought with their lives the time that Greece needed, the inspiration that would rally free people, the example that would echo through the ages. In Sparta, Leonidas's descendants sleep too, the long generations that followed from his daughter, each carrying in their blood a connection to that day in the past. They lived their lives in the shadow of his fame, some trying to live up to it, others simply accepting it as part of their heritage. They too have passed into history, their individual stories forgotten, remembered only as links in a chain connecting that ancient king to the present day. Gorgo sleeps, the queen who lost a husband but never lost her dignity, who raised a daughter alone, who kept alive in Sparta the memory of what Leonidas had done and why it mattered. She lived many years after Thermopylae, long enough to see Greece triumph over Persia, long enough to know that her husband's sacrifice had not been in vain. When her time came, she went to her rest with the same composure she had shown in life, the same strength that had made her a fitting partner for a Spartan king. The city of Sparta sleeps too, though its sleep is the sleep of extinction. The unique society that produced Leonidas eventually failed, unable to adapt to changing times, its rigid system proving too brittle to bend with the winds of history. The ruins of Sparta hold only echoes now, whispers of what once was, fragments of a vanished world. But in its long sleep, Sparta dreams of Thermopylae, of the moment when it was most perfectly itself, when 300 of its sons demonstrated everything the city aspired to be. Even Persia sleeps, the great empire that sent Xerxes and his vast army westward in dreams of conquest. It too fell, conquered in turn by Alexander, absorbed into other empires, transformed beyond recognition. The Persians who fought at Thermopylae, who fell in their thousands against the Greek phalanx, sleep in unmarked graves, their names unknown, their individual stories lost. But they too are part of the tale, for without them there would be no story of resistance, no demonstration of courage, no lesson about what free people can accomplish. The olive trees that once grew near the battlefield sleep through their winter dormancy, as their ancestors did in Leonidas's time, waiting for spring to bring them back to life. The river that flows nearby sleeps in its bed, patient as only water can be, wearing away stone grain by grain, century by century, indifferent to human dramas, yet somehow part of them. The stars that looked down on that ancient battle look down still, unchanged in their courses, eternal witnesses to the brief flash of human life, to courage and fear, to sacrifice and glory, to all the small dramas that play out beneath their gaze. They watched Leonidas fall, watched his men make their final stand, and they watch still as new generations come to this place seeking to understand what happened here. In homes around the world, children sleep having heard the story of the 300, their young minds processing the tale, finding in it something that speaks to them about bravery, about standing up for what is right, about not backing down even when afraid. They dream of heroes, of noble deeds, of being brave when the time comes. Some of them will carry this story with them into adulthood, will remember it in their own moments of testing, will find in it strength they did not know they possessed. Scholars sleep in their studies, surrounded by books about ancient Greece, about Thermopylae, about Leonidas and his age. They have spent their lives analyzing the battle, debating its significance, arguing over details and interpretations. But even they, in their sleep, cannot escape the power of the story, the way it transcends academic analysis and touches something deeper, something that cannot be fully explained in footnotes and citations. Veterans sleep, old soldiers who have faced their own battles, who understand in ways that scholars cannot what it means to stand in formation, to face an enemy, to know fear and act despite it. They dream sometimes of Thermopylae, seeing in it a reflection of their own experiences, finding kinship across the centuries with men who wore different armor but carried the same burden, who fought different enemies but fought for the same essential things. And somewhere in the collective memory of humanity, the story of Thermopylae rests like a sleeper waiting to be awakened. Whenever someone faces a choice between easy surrender and difficult resistance, whenever someone must stand alone for principle, whenever courage is needed in the world, the story stirs, opens its eyes, and speaks once more. The wind continues to blow through the pass, as it always has, as it always will. It carries with it the voices of the past, faint echoes of the paean sung by advancing Spartans, the clash of bronze on bronze, the cries of dying men. But it also carries peace, the deep peace of completion, of a story told, of a task finished, of heroes at rest. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The words remain, carved in stone, carved deeper still in memory. They speak of duty fulfilled, of courage demonstrated, of men who chose honor over life, and in doing so achieved something greater than survival. As the night deepens over Thermopylae, as the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, as the sea maintains its rhythm against the shore, there is a quality to the silence that is not empty, but full, pregnant with meaning, rich with the presence of the past. It is the silence of sacred ground, of a place where something important happened, where the human spirit showed itself capable of nobility. Leonidas sleeps, and with him sleeps all the courage of that age, all the sacrifice, all the glory and the grief. But it is not the sleep of death, not the sleep of oblivion. It is the sleep of something that waits, patient and eternal, ready to wake whenever it is needed, whenever someone remembers and is inspired, whenever the story is told again, and hearts are moved by it. The memorial stands in darkness, the lion keeping watch, the inscription waiting to be read when morning comes and visitors return. But even in darkness, even in silence, the message remains. Courage is possible, sacrifice has meaning, and free people defending their freedom can never be truly defeated. Sleep well, Leonidas. Sleep well, 300 of Sparta. Sleep well, 700 of Thespiae. Sleep well, all who stood and fought and fell in that narrow pass between mountain and sea. Your watch is ended, your duty done, your story told. And the world turns on, time flows ever forward, but you remain eternal in memory, immortal in the human heart, a light in darkness, a voice saying across the centuries, "This is what we can be. This is what we can do." When we choose courage over fear, principle over survival, honor over life itself. And in that message, in that eternal echo, there is peace, the deep, abiding peace that comes from knowing that one's life had meaning, that one's sacrifice served a purpose, that the struggle, however brief, however costly, was worth it. It is the peace of completion, of rest well earned, of heroes sleeping the sleep of the just. The night continues over Thermopylae, quiet and peaceful, and in that quietness, in that peace, the story rests, waiting to be told again, waiting to inspire again, waiting to remind us all of what human beings are capable of when they have something worth dying for, and the courage to see it through.